All right. Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad Podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. I am your host, DL, America's most objective libertarian. If you're tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time so early. All right, folks, it is time for another Dad Talk Friday. I have been working on trying to reach out to some dads and get them on the show. You know, we like to have dads on here and just talk about what's important to them as a dad. And, you know, that could be kind of challenging for me because if you tuned in yesterday, you will know that I'm not so good at scheduling people. So what we need to do is blow this podcast up so that I could, so that I have the funds to hire somebody to do the scheduling for me. That's really what needs to happen. But as you probably already know, this show doesn't run on Freedom Fumes alone. If you're watching me on Rumble, smash that green $sign during the show to drop a Rumble rant. It's kind of like tossing me a cold one at 7:30 in the morning, keeps the vibes high and the mics on. If you want to go all in, click subscribe for just $5 a month. Your support helps me fight the good fight and get to a place where I can produce a better show, perhaps by hiring some people. So we'll get there one of these days. All right, let's get into this. What are we talking about? We're going to talk about age gap relationships today. Now, on Dad Talk Fridays, I do one of two things. I either have a dad on, and we just talk about things. We get away from politics. We just talk about whatever's important to the dad. There's no argument. There's no debate. I just, like, hey, let's two dads. Let's have a chat. That's it. That's simple. But when I don't have a dad, I talk about something dad-related or husband-related or just man-related, Like this is mano-y-mano here, man to man. Of course, for you ladies out there that are watching, you can listen in and get some of my wonderful and brilliant insight. So today we're going to talk about age gap relationships. There's been some online conversation about age gap relationships where one person is much younger and the other person is much older. Conversations seem to mostly focus on 18 to 20-year-old girls with, say, a 40-year-old man. Now, there was a clip between Andrew Wilson and a young fellow named Oliver Niehaus. He supposedly woke male feminist that got some attention. I weighed in and had some responses. So here we are having this conversation. So let's start by watching the clip in question. Just this is the clip of the episode where Andrew is debating Oliver, and I believe they were debating the broad topic of feminism. Now, I want to point out there is some profanity in this clip. I try to keep the show family friendly. However, I can't always do that when I'm bringing in other clips and, trying to silence them or put the old, 90s beep in there. That doesn't really work. It's too much effort. I'm sorry. So we'll just, have to give you the warning, and, there's a few F-bombs, but we'll get past it. No big deal. So let me play that clip. And for this, we're not going to use Dad TV today. We're just going to use the normal standard screen. So here we are. Let's play that clip.
If you date an 18-year-old, what's the problem?
Date an 18-year-old?
Yeah.
At a different stage of life.
So?
What do you mean?
Why do you have to be at the same stage of life to date someone? That's stupid.
Because I think you should want to date someone who's on your level.
Yeah, but people fall in love, have massively dissimilar interests, different IQs, different everything, and absolutely love each other.
Mm-hmm.
What's the fucking problem with that?
I don't think there's a problem with it when you get a lot older, but I do think like men of your age dating women who are in their late teens, even if it's legal, is weird.
Why is it weird? That's quite the argument. It's weird.
Hold on.
Weird.
Are you arguing that there is nothing problematic whatsoever at all with, how old are you, like 50?
Well, no, I'm younger than you, probably.
Okay, I'm sorry. I would interrupt that. Said, how old are you, 50? Like, Andrew tells him he's like 40. So, like, imagine somebody thinking that you're 50. Like, I'll just say, like, even like if you're a man, it's not such a big deal. By the way, I just want to point out, I got a comment in that says, hey, you're a little quiet this morning. Let me know. I did turn the volume up on this. Let me know if that is sufficient or if I need to increase the volume a little bit more. But hopefully this will be a little bit better. And then I'll try to project my voice because I know you guys are so far away. But just let me know, and hopefully these adjustments have corrected it. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of stop and make that point and then just kind of give a little chuckle that this young guy, and we'll hear about their ages here in just a moment, thought that Andrew was 50. I'm almost 50, so I'm just, I can't give him too hard of a time.
How old are you?
I'm 21. 22. Sorry.
Oh, okay. That accounts for the stupidity. No. I'm 41.
Nice.
41.
41.
So 22 and 41.
Nothing wrong with you if you wanted to go by UC Santa Barbara right now, and
So what would be wrong with me dating an 18-year-old woman who wanted to date me? Why would that be problematic? Why? What's strange about it?
Because you are in different life experiences than she is. She is vastly.
Do you think 41-year-old women are going to be like? Let's say I wanted children. Don't you think I should date younger if I wanted to have a lot of children?
Date an 18-year-old to have children?
Well, you're going to be able to give me the most amount of children, right?
Okay.
Can you tell me what's wrong with that, Oliver?
Yes.
What?
Because you were taking advantage of someone.
Oh, taking advantage. Isn't it the case that if I'm 41, she's 18, the chances that our children are going to have more resources than if she had children with another 18-year-old, our children are likely going to have way more resources, right, Oliver?
I think having a differential like that is going to introduce a lot of other problems.
Can you answer the fucking question, Oliver?
I don't know, Andrew.
You don't know?
No.
You don't know if the average 41-year-old has children with 18-year-old, that 18-year-old's going to have more resources for their children than with the average 18-year-old, Oliver?
I think she's going to be traumatized as fuck.
Can you answer the fucking question, Oliver? I'm not interested in your emotional state. Answer
You're also not interested in the emotion.
Woo. Okay. That was rough, huh? Now, I didn't watch the whole debate. It's like 6 hours. That's insane, okay? But I did watch that segment. And in fairness to Andrew, Oliver fails to answer his follow-up questions. He's not very good at his rebuttals, and he admits multiple times that he doesn't have answers, which is not necessarily a problem, but when you're in a debate and you're trying to make a point, if you have to concede something, that really doesn't go in your favor. If the whole debate was like that, the segment that I watched, then I really do feel bad for Andrew because that was rough. I mean, that was just a small segment. And while I am leaning in Oliver's direction, I don't think he really was able to articulate the problem here. And that's interesting because we're going to talk a little bit later about this age differential between Andrew and Oliver. Okay? Now, here's the catch. Just because Oliver wasn't able to debate him or wasn't able to make the point, and he was debating, but he wasn't able to make this point and he kind of kept getting backed into a corner, that doesn't mean his arguments were necessarily incorrect. That just means he's poorly articulating and probably hasn't thought them through very much, which includes potential objections. Now, I commented on this video via X, and the responses back to me were kind of fun. So let's check those out real quick, and then we're going to get into a little bit better clip that's going to help us work through this topic. So here we go. Here's my comment. I said, a 40-year-old has twice the total life experience, which more importantly includes 22 years of adult experience to 0. Okay, so once you think about that, we're talking, so the initial conversation was about, 18 and 40. Although some people, say like 20 or whatever, but they're talking about a relatively young, you're just barely into adulthood. So if you're looking at 18 to 40, then when you're 18, you have exactly 0 years of adult experience, okay? Because we don't consider you an adult until you're 18. You may be somewhat mature, you may not be, but you have 0 years of adult experience. That means interacting with other adults, watching how adults behave in adult environments. Anybody my age will tell you for sure, there is a huge difference between high school and when you get into the workplace as an adult, especially as you get older. Vastly different, okay? So there's that issue. The better objection, I said, is power dynamics. So here are what some of the people said back to me. Somebody said, you do realize that this is the best argument for an age gap relationship, yes? If you frame relationships as power struggle, which I didn't frame it as a power struggle. I just said a better objection to this particular arrangement is power dynamics, okay? If you were, why the F would you not want to get the upper hand? So he's kind of making my argument here, Stephen. You're kind of making my point that there is, he's like, well, you want to frame it this way. Why wouldn't you want to get the upper hand? Okay, so whether I frame it, however I frame it, is irrelevant to whether or not somebody else wants to get the upper hand. And if Stephen can think about, hey, this would give me the upper hand, then certainly some other 40-year-old man could as well. Okay? Let's see. What else? Edgar, we had a nice exchange back and forth. I still think he was wrong. He said, you sound like a leftist, stripping the agency from a young adult, which is Andrew's point. There is nothing wrong with it except for it feels icky, which isn't an argument, just a subjective opinion. Now, I agree, feels icky is not really much of an argument. However, am I really stripping agency away if I lead with the argument that when you're 18, you lack a certain level of adult experience compared to a 40-year-old? I am 47. Anybody my age will tell you when I was 27, or particularly when I was 20, I was far less mature than I am now. Vastly. Leaps and bounds. Okay? That is the understood reality for virtually everybody. That when you're 20, you're young and dumb, and you know how the saying goes. And then when you're 40, you're supposed to be mature and wiser. And when you're not, we criticize you and we say, you're 40 years old. What are you doing with your life? Right? Like, this is how we already exist in our society. So, but the whole idea of being leftist is interesting because I'm actually not addressing agency. I'm not criticizing and saying like they have no agency. Just because you have agency doesn't mean you have wisdom, doesn't mean you have maturity. Okay? You can still have agency and just be stupid. As Andrew pointed out, he was like, oh, well, you're 22. That explains the stupidity. Great. So Andrew's kind of agreeing with me already that when you're 20, you're not as wise as you are when you're 40. That's my point. My point has nothing to do with agency. All right, moving on. Somebody else said, power dynamics exist because of money. Not always. And they said, not age. Okay, but not always. So it can happen in any relationship. That is true. The dude defending it in this video is an arse. Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Like, he wasn't very good, but he's 22. I'm not expecting a whole lot out of a 22-year-old. There's someone you might know here goes on to say, I mean, in a normal, healthy relationship, he ain't mentally healthy. Okay, right. And that's what we're trying to identify here is what leads to what's the most likely do age gap relationships lead to a normal, healthy relationship? And if so, under what conditions? That's kind of like the question that we have here. Continuing on, somebody else said, includes 22 years old, 22 years of adult experience to 0, while my bros enlist grab gun to Warzone at age 20, LOL. Okay, that's an entirely different conversation, whether or not we should be sending our 20-year-olds to war. But just suffice it to say, I'm anti-war, and if it were up to me, our 20-year-olds, whether they're allowed to be in the military or not, would simply not be going to war. It wouldn't even be much of an argument because we'd be like, when was the last time a 20-year-old went to war? Okay? But again, this is really an unrelated point. We need to start sticking to the issue at hand and work within that realm rather than just grabbing these random things and just be like, oh yeah, well, what about this over here? I don't know. What about, huh? Let's see. This one I had a nice exchange with. When I say nice, I do mean that in quotations. When someone posts about power dynamics, they're foregoing any belief in a partnership dedicated to raising a family and looking at the relationship as purely who gets to be in control. Okay, so no, I'm not. I'm telling you that there is an element of power dynamics that is problematic between a 40-year-old and an 18-year-old. Or from here on out, I'll just say 40 and 20 because I think it'll be easier just to remember. Okay, I'm saying that when you have a 20-year difference, you have a power dynamic issue at hand, not just any relationship. And I'm not saying that relationships are built on the idea of a power dynamic either. Perhaps there are, right? But that's not my argument. Then he goes on and says, those kinds of people are generally toxic and should be avoided. Check for nose rings. So as you can see, there are no nose rings. When I was in my early 20s, I did have a septum spike along with like punk rock hair and, you know, all the accoutrements and all that good stuff. I was totally punk rock back then because I was in my 20s. And then I growed up and I realized that I'm not like a rock star where I can carry on that look. I'm not a tattoo artist. I'm not an artist of any kind. You know, those areas where you kind of expect someone to look a little avant-garde. Yeah, that's not me. I work in corporate America. So I'm different now. I've grown up. Okay, this is my point. The whole argument can be addressed on the basis of maturity. Maturity that society already acknowledges. Let's see. LOL. You just used the state's adult age to form your individual opinion. Silence, bootlicker. Bootlick. Okay. Yes, the state does necessarily say at 18, you are an adult. Want to take any guesses where that comes from? Oh, yeah, the people, the society. That's why different states have different ages for things like driving and maybe when you can get married, right? Because the people in those states had different ideas. So it's not like, yeah, you could say, oh, well, you're just a bootlicker because that's the state. No, it's not just the state. The state got that information or that idea from the people, as we could see throughout the 50 states. That's a bizarre argument anyway. Bootlicker? Come on. You guys got to do better than this. Is an 18-year-old woman a strong boss babe who can do sex work and vote, or is she a helpless child? I didn't say helpless child, okay? And I'm not talking about strong boss babes either. Like, again, see, these are the kind of arguments that don't really make any sense. But I'm just telling you what kind of feedback I got. All right, last one here. Power dynamics is used by retards. When I was 25 and 145 IQ, I was far more competent than a 45-year-old person with 100. They mean 100 IQ. So if I'm going to nitpick here, I will just say when I was 25 and 145 IQ. So I assume that you have dropped a few IQ points since then based on how you wrote. I mean, isn't it weird when somebody's like, I'm so high IQ, and then they write a sentence that, and we're not nitpicking like, dude, you forgot a comma. No, like the sentence as written suggest, I guess you technically could say it's a comma here, but suggest that his IQ has went down. So I'm just saying, if you're going to brag about your IQ, perhaps the grammar should be a little bit more impressive. I don't know. Okay, so that's the feedback I got. All right, so not very useful there. So how do we get to the bottom of this? And more importantly, how is Andrew wrong? Well, let me lay out some guide rails for my argument. My argument is not, should it be legal or should it be illegal? Okay? As we've established, 18-year-olds are considered legal adults. Legal adults can't enter into relationships with other legal adults. Therefore, age gap relationships are legal. Okay? So we're not talking about the legality here. I'm not suggesting that they should be illegal. Okay? And then I'm not making a moral versus immoral argument. Now, what I'm about to say may not be complete, so bear with me. I'm just trying to make some quick commentary about where my position is and where it isn't, okay? So morality requires punishment, think of it in terms of legal, or condemnation. Typically think of that as religious, but not always. It could just be, a social thing that people just don't like, but not necessarily driven by religious views. More importantly, morality requires a clearer line of demarcation for behavior. So think of it this way. In the legal sense, you have murder, right? Which is always wrong. And I mean the legal version of murder, not like the casual, colloquial version of murder where people say that about any time somebody gets killed. Okay, we're talking about the legal term murder. It's always wrong. In the condemnation area, you have things like watching pornography, which is always condemned. Why don't I say it's always? It's condemned by many faiths. I imagine there's probably a few out there that are like a little bit more liberal. But most religious faiths will condemn pornography while pornography remains legal. Okay? So there's clear demarcation there. Like, it's not like you're not going to go to church and your pastor's not going to be like in one breath say, okay, pornography is moral for a single guy, but immoral for a married guy. They're just going to say it's immoral, period. right? And they draw a line, a very clear line, okay? And as you're going to see, I'm not making that kind of a clear line like that. I think we're talking about a spectrum here, and we have to evaluate it. So my argument is really that certain age gap relationships ought to be generally condemned socially, not necessarily religious, but they could, while others not, based on how our society currently understands maturity levels of the ages. Those who paid attention to my post a few moments ago will note that I explicitly said 18 and 40, not just simply an age gap. That will be important as we walk through this next clip. Now, this next clip also is of Andrew, and it comes from the same podcast, the Whatever Podcast, and it's also a many-hour episode. It's like 7 hours or something like that. And this is with Andrew talking to a number of young women about this topic. And this topic actually comes up twice, but this clip that I grabbed was far more tolerable and useful for making my response. So let's play that clip, and we'll see what we can learn from that.
Let's say she wanted to date a 35-year-old. Doesn't even have to be me. Could be somebody else, right? If she wanted to date a 35-year-old, would you object to her wanting to date the 35-year-old or to the 35-year-old wanting to date her?
To the 35-year-old wanting to date her.
Okay.
It gives you the ick, doesn't it?
No, because it just shows their maturity is low. Like, why would you want to date a teenager at 35? That makes no sense. Like,
you mean an adult?
Okay. So this is interesting. The young woman seems to be viewing this from a maturity level, while Brian, the host, the guy on the far left there, he slyly interjects adult. So this is our first disconnect, because just because someone is an adult doesn't make them mature. Okay? Anybody my age will tell you the decision. We will look back and we will say, yeah, when I made all these decisions at the age of 20, many of them were dumb. And why did I make them? Because I didn't have the requisite experience to make better ones. And it doesn't matter. Like, even if you're a mature 18-year-old, you will still make decisions at the age of 18 that you would not make when you are 40. So it doesn't, like, you can't even say, well, some people are more mature. Yes, it still applies to them. Now, what they may not do is they may not make as many bad decisions that they would later go on to say, yeah, I made that decision when I was young and foolish. They may make fewer of them, perhaps, but they will still make them, because we as a society already agree that the maturity level of a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old are vastly different. So that's our first disconnect. Let's see. Yeah, that's all my notes on that one. So let's continue listening.
I think that I say the latter because a 35-year-old man has more experience than a 19-year-old girl.
So does a 25-year-old man.
Huh?
So does a 25-year-old man.
Right, but like more than 10 years is quite a bit.
Okay. She rightfully points out that a 35-year-old man has more experience than a 19-year-old girl. Andrew's rebuttal is that so also does a 25-year-old man. However, he fails to acknowledge that a 35-year-old has more experience than a 25-year-old. In other words, the distance between 35 and 19 is greater than the distance between 25 and 9. It's a difference of 16 years and 6. The 35-year-old man literally has almost a little bit more than 2.5 times the adult experience than even a 25-year-old. Andrew's point here should not be well taken, okay? Because if we agree that when we're 20, we're not as mature as we are when we're 40, then we recognize that there is maturity that is slowly improving or progressing as we work our way toward the age of 40. Therefore, when you say 40 versus, and I'm going to continue to use 20, when you say 40 versus 20, that's 20 years of experience that one person has against 25 and 20, which is only an additional 5 years. They're actually a lot closer in their maturity levels on the average, okay? Again, there are exceptions. We're not necessarily talking about those. So let's continue on and let's see what else they say.
Have you ever dated a man who you had a 10-year gap with, have you? See, I want to tell you this trend that I've noticed. Right? I used to think that all of the women who said, I have zero moral argument to this whatsoever and people should be allowed to do what they want, but I just think it's icky. I used to think that they were just dumb. And I'd be like, you got to just be dumb to believe that because you have no moral argument against it at all. So why do you believe? But then I figured this out after talking to so many of them. All of the ones who go, it gives me the ick, they've all been in an age gap relationship.
Wait, did I say it gave me the ick?
Didn't say? Yeah, you did kind of say it gave you the ick. What other objection could you have?
No.
Okay. So he's like, what other objection could you have? He's basically saying you don't have one based on morality. So is there one? And I'm saying, yes, there is. It's based on maturity. Now you can make a moral argument if that's your position. That isn't mine. Okay? Because I think that we have a spectrum that we have to work with, and there is not a clean-cut line for a moral distinction in the same way we might think of like murder and pornography and some other things where we say, look, it is always wrong to do this, or it is always wrong to do this under this circumstance. I don't think that's applicable. I think it's a harder argument to make, but I think the maturity argument absolutely needs to be addressed, and I don't believe from what I've seen that Andrew has actually addressed this maturity one. I believe he sidesteps it quite a bit. All right, so let's continue listening.
No, it's not that it gives me the ick. It's that I think that there's a gap in knowledge and experience.
There's a gap in knowledge and experience with people your own age. You can date somebody your own age, exactly your age, and they could be 10 times more sophisticated than you and dumber than the 35-year-old down the street.
Right, but in that situation.
Okay, so Andrew now does what Brian did earlier, and he sidesteps the maturity level by introducing intelligence, sophistication, whatever that means, right? So he's talking now about these other elements. Neither of those two elements address maturity, which, again, I think is what the young woman is attempting to address. And she's doing a far better job than the young man that we saw especially when I watched the whole exchange. Furthermore, Andrew isn't entirely incorrect when he says that within one's own age, there are differences between intelligence, maturity, perhaps wealth, so on and so forth. The distinction, however, is that two random 20-year-olds are far more likely to be within range of each other than any random 20-year-old and random 40-year-old, right? Like, you see the point here? 20-year-olds, the norm, the standard, I don't want to say the standard, the expectation is that they're going to be within a range of each other, and anybody who is exceptionally wealthy, who is an exceptionally intelligent or exceptionally mature, they are going to be the outlier. Whereas with a 20 and a 40-year-old, the 40-year-old, they will be the outlier if they are not more mature, not more wealthy. Intelligence is a different matter because you're either intelligent or you're not, right? You either have a high IQ or you don't, all right? So I don't know that one, I don't think that's a value add in this conversation whatsoever, all right? So he is arguing the exception, not the rule, whereas the young woman appears to be making her argument partially from the rule rather than the exception. All right, let's continue.
It puts young girls at risk to be put in really negative, life-altering situations.
Really?
That, as a man, you put that younger woman in that position.
What position would this be?
A position that maybe she was too naive to know she was getting herself into.
Yeah, but she could be in that position no matter what.
Right. But
why would
especially
age,
more likely when...
Why is age the factor?
Because of experience.
Okay, so she correctly points out experience here, and this is why I think that she's really trying to make an argument from the point of view of maturity, right? And it is the distinction here. It is not really the age in itself. The age is just an identifying factor for maturity because, again, if you're 40, more than likely you will be more mature than it is expected that you're going to be more mature than a 20-year-old, right? And you are the outlier if you are not. Perhaps maybe in these days, in this day and age, 40, not being very mature is less of an outlier, but that's a conversation for another day, right? And then a 40-year-old has more experience than a 30-year-old than a 20-year-old. Exceptions are just that, exceptions. Her point about putting women in a negative, life-altering situation, however, also should not be taken well, because it isn't clear that is necessarily the rule, as we'll see in just a moment. So let's continue and listen to the rest of this.
Okay. In the UK, there's a department of statistics. They took all of the relationships ever, all of the marriages on record ever that they have. They wanted to see if the age gap relationships failed as much as the similar age relationships. They don't. They don't fail at any higher rate. They said there's no statistical anomaly between the two. How could that be if the sophistication is such that these men who are older, and they were talking 20 years in some of these gaps, can you explain why it is that those relationships wouldn't fail any more than similar age relationships?
Okay, so I looked up the study. Link is in the show notes if you want to check it out. It is indeed, as he says, though they actually looked at relationships between 1963 and 2005. So it's not actually like ever, okay? So case closed, right? Age gap relationships don't fail at a rate higher than age relationships. Well, not so fast. So I looked up the study and I read it, and there's a major limitation. The study treats all age gap relationships equally. That is, there is no distinction made between, say, 20 and 40, 30 and 50, or 50 and 70, all 20 years apart. There's no distinction between them. They just kind of lump them all together, and they say, hey, we don't find any distinct difference between. So what we don't know is what level of age gap relationship exists or start between 20 and 40-year-olds, 30 and 50-year-olds, 50 and 70-year-olds, and so on and so forth. You could mix and match any numbers that you want with a 20-year age difference. That is important, because when dealing with the issue of maturity, to know the success or the failure rate of age gap relationships, it's necessary to ask a few questions, such as the age gap relationships of those that fail. Do the younger age gaps fail at the same rate as older age gaps? And how many are there? Like, do you see a higher rate of age gaps in the older age ranges than you do the younger age ranges? Are 20s and 40s relationships as successful as those who are 30 and 50, as those who are 50 and 70? Okay, this reminds me of an argument that the great Thomas Sowell, who turned 95 recently, he made about the deceiving use of statistics. So what he wants you to do, and I'm going to deviate here a little bit just to kind of illustrate and make a point. He asked you to imagine 10 households, each with a married couple. And each couple makes $100,000, or each person in that household makes $100,000 per year. So that makes you have that means you have an average of $200,000 per household. Now imagine that 3 of those households divorce, and of those 3 households, the spouse moves out. You know, one of the spouses moves out to another home. Okay, so now you have 13 households, 7 of which have $200,000 income. 6 of them now have $100,000 income. Okay, the media might report something like household incomes went down from an average of $200,000 to $153,000, and they'll tell you about how bad the economy is and how this is and how bad marriage is or whatever, right? But here's the problem: while the now single spouses are less financially off than they previously were, that's compared to what they were, okay, because their incomes are no longer pooled together and they no longer share the expenses, it doesn't say anything about whether each of the households feels better off, whether or not they are in a better position just in life in general, okay? Because I want you to think about this. $200,000, and then you drop down to $100,000. You can still pay your bills. You can still have Netflix. You maybe still pay somebody to come and cut your grass, right? It's not as good as $200,000, but it still may be sufficient. So do you see how we have to be very mindful about using statistics? And when we're paying it, like, we have to pay attention. We have to learn to ask the right questions. I think Andrew is basically doing the same thing here. He's using data to his advantage, while those he's debating and even onlookers, people watching, are none the wiser, right? They don't ask these questions. They don't say, well, wait a minute. What about these age, like, let's dig into the data a little bit more and see if the data really does tell us that. In the same way that we might look and say, what does the average, household income actually tell us versus what do we think it tells us? What does this study that says, hey, age gap relationships do that, even up to 20 years do not fail at a rate higher than similar age marriages. And so what does that study actually tell us versus what does it not tell us, right? Now, here's my argument. Virtually no one would say, and we're going to use extremes here, okay? And I'm getting to a point, so don't freak out. Virtually no one would say that a 10-year-old and a 30-year-old are in a appropriate relationship. Number one, the 10-year-old cannot consent, for starters, and that's the basis for what? What is that the basis for? If you said maturity, please go to the head of the class. Ding, got my ding in there. All right? On the flip side, virtually no one would object to a 50-year-old marrying a 70-year-old. Right? But both cases are exactly 20 years apart. That the 30-year-old might have the resources to take care of the 10-year-old, well, that becomes irrelevant. Likewise, at 50 and 70, it's reasonably assumed that the resources are far less of an issue. That if you have a 50-year-old woman marrying a 70-year-old man, the 50-year-old woman is not necessarily marrying him just because he has nice resources. She probably has some of her own resources. Not a guarantee, but it's a reasonable assumption. The resource argument is superseded by the issue of maturity. Therefore, that should be the focus. It's an extraneous argument to say, oh, yeah, well, what if they're well taken care of? Okay, you could make that argument about a 10-year-old and a 30-year-old, and we would reject it because there is a higher principle. So now let's focus on the principle. In between those age gap ranges, that is 10 and 30 and 50 and 70, lies where most age gap relationships start, right? Like we're going to assume that age gap relationships, the ones that we want to focus on, start at like 18, or in my case here that I'm using 20, okay, just to make the math, the numbers easy. All right. This is also why I'm not making a legal or a moral argument based on the age gap, because in one context, 10 and 30, you have a legal problem. You also have a moral problem. On the other hand, at 50 and 70, you don't have a legal problem, nor do you have a moral problem. The age gap is too encompassing. It ranges too far. And somewhere in between, we have where reality actually exists. Now, Andrew's study is nice, but it doesn't quite give the picture that we need to accurately determine the value of age gap relationships. Now, you might ask yourself, well, DL, do you have any evidence to support younger age gaps are less successful than older ones? And the answer is no. Or at least I was unable to find any that focused and said, okay, we're going to evaluate 20s and 40s, 30s and 50s, 50s and 70s, or whatever. I couldn't find anything along that line. So in that case, we're going to need to work from inferences where we can. So let me show you a graphic up on the screen. This comes from the Bowling Green University. I said the Bowling Green. Let's see here. Here we go. All right, I'm going to All right, so this comes from Bowling Green. This shows, this is a study on divorce rates comparing 1990 versus 2021, which includes age ranges, okay? And the 30-year difference here is useful because it kind of helps us identify a bit of a trend. I mean, it's only two items, two data points, basically, so I don't know if you would call it a trend more accurately, but it kind of gives us some insight there. All right, and by the way, these numbers on the chart are per 1,000. So we can see that the 15 to 24-year-old divorce rates are far higher than 45 and 50 in 1990. That's the green. All right, we see that it says 47.2 per 1,000 versus 13.1 per 1,000. And then we look at the orange, which would be 2021, and we see that 15 to 24 age range, their rates are only somewhat higher than the 45 to 54, where we're looking at 19.7 per 1,000 versus 15.8 per 1,000. So this is clearly not a smoking gun. I'm not trying to make it one. Again, we're drawing inferences from other data. This is data about divorces just in general. Okay, so it doesn't focus on the age gap. All right, and it doesn't, but what it does do is it shows a downward trend on divorce with age. Now, part of that is going to be likely that you have more people getting married between 15 and 24 than you do, say, like 55 on and up. And so by the time you're at 55 or older, number one, you're less likely to get married, either for the first time or for a repeated offense. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. Don't get me. So there are factors that are at play here. All right. And I'm not, again, this is not a smoking gun. We're just looking and saying, what can we draw a conclusion from with the available information that we have? The available information here suggests that you have higher rates of divorce for younger people than you do for older people. And there are a variety of factors. Marriage and divorce rates have many other factors, right? And all of those things play a role in the success of age gap relationships, okay? What should society do? That's really the question that we have here. How should we approach this? What should we be okay with it? Well, in my opinion, number one, we cannot criminalize this. Why? Number one, for starters, you have adults. We're talking about adults. I already established that if you're 18, you are a legal adult. You can legally enter into a relationship with another adult. The other reason is this is a spectrum, okay? You have differences between 20 and 40, and you have differences between 50 and 70, maturity-wise. And we know this because those same age ranges or those same ages, we have an understood reality when it comes to their maturity levels. Like I said earlier, if a 20-year-old says or does something dumb, we're not terribly surprised. We're a little bit more surprised or maybe irritated when a 40-year-old does it, right? Or when somebody is like 70, we're like, by this time, you should be the wise old man or woman, okay? So what can we do? We can stigmatize. That's the buffer, I think, that will help reduce women that do find themselves in a negative situation. As the young girl pointed out earlier, she seemed to be relying on that as part of her argument. And I'm saying that's an element of the argument, but that is not the focal point. Now, I want to end here with adding a couple of additional points. It's interesting that Andrew, who is 40, is debating this topic with 20-year-olds. Now, it's not a problem. You can do that. Yeah, we like to, in my community, the libertarian circles, we like to make fun of Ben Shapiro, who would be an older person going out and trying to dunk on college kids. Same concept, right? But I'm going to make the argument that Andrew is actually, in a way, taking advantage of them. Not in knowledge, okay? Like when he mentioned the study, I was not familiar with the study until I pulled it up and read the study. Okay, so I'm not saying that he's more knowledgeable per se, or that he's got higher IQ, but he's taking advantage of their ignorance in asking the right questions. If you notice what I did, I read the study and then I started asking questions. I was like, well, wait a minute. Is there a higher success rate or a higher failure rate between a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old who get married versus a 50-year-old and a 70-year-old who gets married? Well, the information doesn't appear to be available. But when I compare to divorce rates, when I compare to our expectations based on age elsewhere in society, we see that 20-year-olds are more prone to making mistakes, being, changing up their mind, I like this, I don't like this, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas as you get older, you become more set into what you who you are and what you are doing. You see the point that I'm making here? I recognize there is a maturity difference, so I started asking the right questions. None of these 20-year-olds, because all the girls in the video, I think the oldest one was like 26, and that was not the one speaking. So the girl that was actually speaking was under 26. So I'm gonna assume she's like 24. We'll just go with that. Early 20s. And then Oliver, the guy at the very beginning of the show that we looked at, he's 22, and Andrew is 40. Now, I think that they're on the right path, but they're not necessarily asking the right questions. Why? Because they don't have the experience to. When I was 20, I might not have asked these same questions that I'm doing now, that I'm asking now. So I think that Andrew is, in a sense, taking advantage of the fact that they're too young to have to recognize, hey, here's an argument being presented to me. Here are the right questions that I need to be asking. Because they could have asked him those same questions if they had known better. Anybody could if they knew better. Andrew could say, hey, this study here proves that age gap relationships are not problematic, that they don't have a higher failure rate. Now, another question that they might have asked is, where's the study from? I think he does say England. It's actually England and Wales, which is interesting because when you look up the information, you find that England and Wales, they show that age gap relationships as a whole are not more they're not more prone to failure than similar age range marriages. They also found similar results out of Germany. But then you had a host of many other countries that found the exact opposite, that once you get past about 10 years in an age gap, the rate of failure goes up tremendously. So he kind of cherry-picked a little bit. He picked the study that he knew would work for him, and the people debating him, the young people, they had no better sense than to say, well, tell me more about this study. You cannot argue a study that you have not read, that you have no knowledge about, other than here are what the results say. And so you have to ask questions. These 20-year-olds, they didn't know to ask those questions. Had I been sitting there, one of my first questions would have been like, where's this study coming from? How many people are included in this? Right? And he kind of gives that at the very beginning. And then I might say, how does that compare to other countries? Do other countries get the same results? If they do not, why not? Is there something about England and Wales that is different, maybe in their culture? Is there something about the age gap ranges that is different in England than, say, the United States or elsewhere where they found the exact opposite? Those are the questions that I would have asked, and Andrew would have been forced to answer. And if he had answered, because anybody that's seen his debates knows that he tends to keep people in a corner like a boxing match. Had anybody been able to corner him on those questions, he either would have had to fess up and say, basically acknowledge that he's cherry-picked it, or he might not have known himself. I don't know. Okay, so that's the first issue. The second issue that's worth pointing out, and he mentioned this early on, he's like, talks about this ick factor. Well, I want you to think about something. Andrew himself acknowledges that women with past experiences have this ick factor where they're not willing to necessarily say it's immoral, but they just are like, yeah, this is gross. Now, that's not for nothing. Now, let's be clear, that doesn't mean everything, but it's not nothing either. Because now we have to start asking more questions, such as, why is it that he keeps running into women such that he was able to come up with this notion of the ick factor that he himself acknowledged? And not just one woman, multiple women, many women that he keeps finding. He didn't say, hey, I found it 50-50, where half the women that I run into that have had a previous relationship that was age gapped found it icky, and the other half said, yeah, it's not so bad, just wasn't for me, whatever, right? He didn't say that. He focused in on this ick factor. That was his dunking point. Okay, well, great. That dunking point now becomes a dunking point on himself, because it's like, now we have to ask the question of like, how many of these women exist in total? Like, do most women come away saying age gap relationships when you're 20 are bad, or do half of them come away, or do few of them come away? Because if most of them do, then that tells you something about that age gap relationship, say 20 and 40, right? And then we would have to continue asking questions and say, all right, how does that factor in when we're talking about 30 and 50? How does it factor in when we talk about 50 and 70? I presume just based on observing our culture, that we would find that most women and men, but we're talking about women here, I guess, most women who are 50 years old and marry a 70-year-old are not walking away, like almost all of them are not walking away saying, ick, I can't believe I did that. Pretty sure that's not happening. I don't have any evidence for it, but again, just based on observation of what I've seen, I'm not seeing it, right? Same thing for 30 and 50. I even pointed out in one of the exchanges that I had with some of the people that were coming at me, I specifically said 18 and 40. I have a friend who is 50. He is dating, I think she's 30. She might be a little older than 30. She might be like early 30s, but basically we'll call it 30, just to make it easy. I don't see any problem with that. Why don't I see any problem with that? Because I am focusing on the maturity level. She has 12 years at least. I don't remember her exact age, but she has at least 12 years of adult experience. That's experience in the workplace, dealing with men, dating, so on and so forth. That's a lot more than 0, which is what an 18-year-old would have. A 20-year-old would only have 2. Okay? Nobody's going to tell you, man, by the time you're 20, you are super wise. Nobody says that. Why? Because we recognize that maturity is something that you grow into and that you make poor choices, or you make choices that you later look back and say, yeah, I wouldn't do that again, even if it wasn't necessarily a poor choice. You might just say, yeah, that wasn't the best choice. So considering this ick factor and women with their experiences, let me read to you a story. So this is one of the responses that I found when I was doing some research online, and this video clip was going around. So this is a woman named Michaela. I'm not going to put it up on the screen because it's way too much text to try to put on the screen. So I'm just going to read it to you. This relationship changes your view of men forever. When I was 20, I got a sugar baby offer from a 60-year-old tech executive. It was tempting. I would work up to 3 jobs while juggling school, studying a hard major. To be honest, you've probably used the tech. I knew what the deal was. He was rich. I was young. He knew I could use the help. He even showed me a picture of his similarly aged son and him in their airplane. His son was bound to a fancy private school. And I pretended to like him. I projected my innocence because that's what he liked. She's an adult. That's what she's quoting here. Yes, and you're using her. A girl who can be your daughter, and you're using her. So I think she makes a very good point here, Michaela. She's pointing out, like, yes, an adult can still be used. We see that all the time, and none of that was addressed. It's kind of assumed like, oh, you have agency, therefore you cannot be used. But that's not true. That's not how the real world operates. Michaela goes on to say, to be honest, I'd cry myself to sleep wondering if I should accept because I was just so exhausted working like a dog with no help. So maybe letting an old dude use my body wasn't so bad of a deal, but I was too scared of God. Men in these relationships never think about the girl. All they ever say is, she's an adult. I did not accept the offer, but I do not view men the same anymore. So I want you to think about that. This changed her. This experience changed her. And she wasn't even in an age gap relationship. And she acknowledges, to Andrew's point, hey, man, this guy could have really helped me out. Here I am struggling. I'm working 3 jobs. I am trying to go to school. I am exhausted. It would be great if I could have a little bit of financial help. And perhaps all I got to do is be his arm candy, maybe a little bit more, right? So now we have the argument in play of, oh, resources. He has them. And even though she did not accept, and I'm assuming that she's telling the truth here, she looks at that and she says, I do not view men the same anymore. This experience changed her for the negative, and she didn't even have the relationship. She just flirted a little bit. She walked away and she said, that was gross. So she did. She said, that's the ick, right? I don't think the ick factor is a strong argument. But I don't think it's not. I don't think we can ignore it either, because the ick factor is based on experiences. What we need to do, what we need to ask is, okay, how many experiences are like that? How many women walk away from, being 20 in an age gap relationship and regret it and say that was a terrible decision, I shouldn't have made it, versus how many that are 30 that do the same thing, versus how many that are 50 that do the same thing, right? This is not to say that they'll necessarily be more successful at 30 or 50. They could all equally have the same failure rate, right? Or maybe they don't. But what we need to do is say, of those that fail, what is the perception that they walk away with? What are the problems that they had? And do they match at different age levels? And I say they don't. And I say he didn't. I say that Andrew did not acknowledge any of them. So hopefully I've made the case for you on why a 20-year-old should not necessarily be with a 40-year-old. Now keep in mind, I'm not making a moral argument, and I'm not making a legal argument. And again, the reason is because there are exceptions. Okay, I would imagine that you could find somebody out there who's 20 years old, has a level head, married a 40-year-old, and went on to have a very long, loving relationship. I'm not denying that's a possibility. What I am arguing is I do not believe that this is the expectation, that we should tell our 20-year-olds, you are more than likely going to find a good relationship by marrying a 40-year-old man. And the reason I say that is because we have plenty of young women who have come out of those very type of relations, those very same relationships, and they've now come out and they've got the ick factor, right? They're not articulating a very strong argument, but their ick factor is not for nothing. It means something. It means we need to start asking more questions, which Andrew doesn't do. So I think he's taking advantage of the fact that these are young people that are impressionable and they don't have the skill set to make better arguments, which is fine. Like, I'm just criticizing him. Okay, I'm not saying it should be legal. I'm not saying he should be punished. I'm just saying we should look at it and go, yeah, you're 40, they're 20. What'd you expect? You expect them to dunk on you left and right? Come on. That would be absurd. Unless he happened to be one of the really dumb 40-year-olds that he mentioned early on. But he's not a dumb person. And I think he's probably pretty intelligent. And I think that he probably knows this. Inside, deep inside, I think he knows I'm dunking on a 20-year-old. I totally got the upper hand here. But I'm going to do it anyway because I've got to feed my ego. So that's my show, folks. Let's dive into the comments. Let's see what you guys are saying over there in the chat. Let me do something here real quick. Let's get these. I forgot to add something here so that the messages pop up here. So we'll do that. And ba-boom. All right, we got a little bit of music here. So let's see what you guys are up to and saying. All right, so the audio did come in better. That's great. Let's see. Keith says, generalization can be useful, but like any other tool it is job specific. Absolutely. We got to be careful about our generalizing, right? And when you generalize, make sure that you acknowledge the objections, potential problems, failures, etc. Right? That makes, I think, your generalization a little bit stronger because if you say like, yeah, women, if you just say 20-year-old women are dumb, and then someone goes, what about this 20-year-old woman here who is like a research scientist and makes all these great decisions? Well, now you're going to look like a fool for having said that. But if you say, yeah, on average, 20-year-old women don't make wise decisions, well, then now you've kind of acknowledged that there are exceptions. And so then you're not going to get your butt handed to you for missing or ignoring the exceptions. Let's see, what else we got? What else we got? Biblical Anarchy Podcast, thank you for joining, says the ability to consent is not a line in the sand, but a capacity that grows over time. The average 18-year-old has less capacity for informed consent than the average 21-year-old. Thus, an age gap means less for a 35 to 25-year-old couple than it does for a 41 to 18-year-old couple if within 3 to 5 years and under 25, there isn't an imbalanced cognitive development. Okay, that was an awful lot. Let me try to, I'm trying to read that on the fly here. So let me read that one more time just so I make sure. The ability to consent is not a line in the sand. Okay, I agree with that. For purposes of making the argument more simple, I just say like, hey, we've drawn the line at 18. That's our demarcation line to make it easy for us. But we all know there are 17-year-olds that are better at making decisions than, say, 25-year-olds, and in some cases, even 40-year-olds. So I definitely wouldn't argue that. By the way, it looks like the text is all on the screen. All right, so let's continue on. The average 18-year-old has less capacity for informed consent than the average 21-year-old. So therefore, any age gap means less for a 35 to, okay, yeah, I think you're agreeing with me. Less for a 35 to 25-year-old couple than it does a 41 to 18-year-old couple. If within 3 to 5 years and under 25, there isn't an imbalance. Oh, okay, I see what it's saying now. I had to read it a second time. Okay, so yes, I agree. So if you're talking at under the age of 25, you're looking at somewhere between 3 and 5 years of an age gap. And so the maturity level is going to be distinctly different. More similar between those two people, as you would then you would find between 35 and 25, then you would find 41 to 18. So I think we're in agreement there, unless I've totally read that incorrect. Let's see here. Can you function in our society as a self-sufficient grown-up? Oh, I think that was part of a second. Which is why I argue for the rights of adulthood instead of arbitrary age. Can you function in our society as a sufficient grown-up? Keith asked. That's an interesting point. We're not there yet, but it's one that we could argue. We could say, hey, rather than age as the demarcation, maybe there are things that somebody can demonstrate that would say, these actions, what you've demonstrated, show that you are mature, whether you happen to be 18 or 30, right? And if you're a little bit of a slow learner, right? If you're somebody that's, that's having a little bit of trouble shooting off, then I probably shouldn't have said it that way. If your failure to start, I think is the phrase that I was looking for. If you're kind of like failure to start, then perhaps you're not an adult yet. And that's an argument. Now, I don't think we're there as a society, but I think that's a reasonable argument to have. Let's see. There's a good point here. Biblical Anarchy says, I'd argue 18-year-olds probably shouldn't be doing OnlyFans or performing at strip clubs or getting trans surgery. Should the government ban these things? Probably not, but it's tricky. I agree. And in one of my previous episodes, I talked about the culture war, because there's an overlap between legal, adult, and then culture war, right? In a sense. And one of my arguments in the past is I said, when it comes to the culture war, what we as libertarians, what we should do is we should say, all right, there are some things that we can ignore. There are many things for which we should have a huge debate about, and then work out where the situation actually exists. Kind of like what I'm doing here, right? I'm having a conversation. I saw some video footage. I saw some commentary. Now I'm commenting on it. I am contributing to this vastness of debate that we can have about age gap relationships. And then I say, all right, at least for people that are like me who are not an anarchist, you anarchist folk can defend yourselves on this one, but for people like me who are tolerant of limited government, then we can look and we can say, all right, does government have a role to play in something that does need to be explicitly addressed? Or should we just leave it to the free market, right? So, and again, I'm aware that my anarchist peers will object. Okay, I got that. I'm not an anarchist, so I'm gonna defend, my position from a not anarchist position, or as we like to say, a minarchist position. So I would say there are some things for which it's appropriate to have a law against, such as murder or rape or other things along that line. But there are many things that I think are better suited either in the free market or just in society. This is why I say we should stigmatize relationships that are 18 and 40, not because, hey, there's a clear line that we can draw and say at no point ever can an 18-year-old be married to a 40-year-old successfully and have a reasonable, positive relationship, right? I'm not going to say there are none. I'm just going to say there are probably very few. But because you are an adult, I'm not willing to make it illegal. So therefore, we have to resort to stigmatizing and saying, yeah, no. And what does stigmatizing do? It says things like, that's icky, right? It's not a full-fledged argument. But underneath the ick can be an actual argument if Andrew would have at least dug in a little bit more. Let's see. What else we got here? There's a very good point here. IQ does not equal capability. It is absolutely true. In fact, let me put it this way. It's been said that people with Down syndrome are some of the nicest, happiest people. And then we could say some evil people, many evil people, have had high IQs. So IQ doesn't mean that you're going to be any more capable than another person in a relationship where IQ is not necessarily the determining factor, nor does it necessarily mean you're going to be a productive member of society. Like it might mean that you go on to do some cool things like cure cancer or something like that if you have a very high IQ, but along the way, you may murder a whole bunch of people while you're at it. You may be secretly a serial killer. Whereas the person with Down syndrome who's going to have a far less IQ is going to exist in this whole world. Perhaps they're not going to cure cancer, but they will be a good, decent person that we'll actually enjoy being next to, and we're not in fear that they're going to do something crazy to us. So I think it's a great point. Let's see. Keith, he was a jerk. Therefore, all men are jerks. Talk about generalizations. Absolutely. All right, folks. That's my show. I got one more now? No, that was it. That's it. All right, folks. That's my show for today. Hope you found it informative and inspiring. Whether you're watching live or you're watching later, come back, drop me a comment, let me know your thoughts. Did I miss anything? Do I need to offer a correction? Or maybe you just want to come back and be promiscuous with the praise. Whatever the case, I'm all ears. But with that, I'm out, and I will see you Monday with another bill review. Have a good one, folks. You know that I'm all about supporting organizations that hold my values. Make sure you head on over to blackgunsmatter.shop. They've got apparel, stickers, and more. Use the code LibertyDad, all one word, at checkout to score a 10% discount. Or just hit the referral link in the show notes. That'll make it so much easier. Remember, I'm not just a voice on a mic. I'm a dad who's working hard to deliver to you the best libertarian content. Connect with me on Linktree, where you'll find links to my Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, because, every bit helps keep this show rolling. Plus, you can find me on my other platforms to stay in the loop. With your help, this show, The Message of Liberty, will be seen and heard by more people. As always, I appreciate you tuning in and look forward to seeing you in the next episode.